Thanks, everyone for being here and talking with me. I'm here to talk about my book, Chasing the Thrill, which is the story of Forrest Fenn's treasure hunt. And I got into this at the beginning of 2017. When this whole thing was just kind of starting out. Or pardon me, it had been going on for quite some time, but I had actually just finished up with my last book, Dealing with Kings, and the guy who had been my mentor in that book, Jay Rayner, who goes by the name Beep in the fantasy sports world, kind of came to me and basically had introduced me to this crazy treasure hunt. And I was pretty stunned that something like this existed, and that also that it had existed in the world for essentially 7 years without my noticing it at all. How could a treasure hunt like be real, and then how could it escape somebody's notice? And I immediately was just incredibly intrigued by it, and also very, very excited that there was this thing in the world that I could kind of play in. And so a lot of people have asked me, well, did you go into this as journalist or did you go into this as participant first? And, the real truth is that I did both, and I did both essentially from the start. Once I figured that I could join up with this thing, I thought it would be, I very quickly wanted to tell the story of it. I very quickly went to my agent and was like, is anyone doing a book on this? And once she informed me that, for the most part, it seemed like there had not been any real books on it, and that none that we could tell were in the real planning stages, I said, okay, this is a great story. I have to get into this thing. And so I generally feel that, one of the best ways to get into kind of one of these deep dive, down the rabbit hole type worlds is to live the experience that the people in it have been having. It's if you just come in and try to follow, three or four people, you can do that, and that's fine. But you're very much at their mercy. If you pick the right people and if they go in the right places and all that, you're very much at their mercy to dictate the narrative. And you're also kind of, in a spot where I think a lot of the time those end up being a little bit like fishbowl narratives where, there's a little bit of a, look at these crazy people kind of thing. And that's not what I wanted to portray. I wanted to kind of try to help the rest of the world understand why the people in this cared the way they did. And so, I became one of them. So, and also, so I wanted to tell the story in that way. And then also I thought, if you're going to be in a treasure hunt, what's the point of doing it if you don't get to be a treasure hunter? And being a treasure hunter is cool. The whole thing brings you really right back to childhood, to the idea that, you're going to live and be a part of something that you would have, maybe not known existed, but you would have believed in when you were 5 or 6. The entry point that I had was, some of you will be old enough to remember the movie The Goonies, from, I think it was 1985, but there's a chance it was 86. About a bunch of, wisecracking kids who go and seek out pirate treasure. And, I thought that, that this immediately made me think of that and wanting to be a part of that in that same way. And so, I kind of just said, I'm going to go live this thing. And so I said to Beep, Jay, but honestly, Beep most of the time in this, okay, let's go be treasure hunters. Let's go do this. And, I'll kind of follow you and record what you do, and you'll be the primary force here. But I'm gonna live it too. So it's, we just kind of went down that hole as fast as we could, honestly. And so, from the very beginning, when you're doing a book like this, there's a few things you have to check, a few boxes you have to check. Okay, are there good subjects? There was a reasonable amount of, already kind of groundwork laid material. There've been a bunch of good magazine stories on this to that point. And I certainly obviously read those and tried to, get the lay of the land here. But, the most important thing was obviously going to be, is Forrest Fenn going to talk to me? Is this guy who started this treasure hunt going to let me talk to him? Because if he doesn't, this thing isn't going to get very far. I can follow some hunters around, but if I don't have the guy who created this thing for whatever reason he did it, I'm probably going to have a hard time telling this story and, kind of relating this narrative. So I tried to kind of make sure I could do that first by laying the groundwork with people who knew him and talking to them first, and kind of encircling him with people who would say, yeah, I talked to that guy. He wasn't a total idiot. And, maybe that some of that word would trickle back to him. And then when I finally was able to reach out to him, essentially a month or two later, he'd say, oh, yeah, I've heard of you. Okay, fine. So that's kind of the plan I put into place to begin with. And basically started doing interviews with searchers and people connected to Fenn, and, kind of trying to work my way closer to him. And, again, I don't remember if exactly it was a month and a half or what it was, but somewhere around that time, I said, all right, time to go for this and make sure I can get this guy. And, because if I don't get him, this is kind of a non-starter, so just to background everybody in, Forrest Fenn created this treasure hunt, and it was really all about Forrest Fenn in so many ways. He in 1988 had been given what was then believed to be a fatal cancer diagnosis, and was expected to not survive it. And at that time, he came up with the idea that he wanted to take some of his treasure with him to the great beyond. Essentially, it was in a conversation with the fashion designer Ralph Lauren, his friend, that he essentially hatched the germ of this idea that same day and night, to take some of his wealth, put it into a treasure chest, and take that chest with him out into the wilderness, put it put it in a special spot, and then he would essentially take some pills and lay down next to it and die. Morbid as that is, that was essentially his plan. Now, fortunately for I think everyone involved, he beat the cancer and he didn't die. But the idea stuck with him, and so he spent the next 20 plus years curating this poem that was going to essentially serve as a treasure map of sorts to lead people to the treasure, and then fitting it into a memoir, which he wrote. And the memoir would contain the poem, but would also have all these stories from his life. Things that range from the mundane, like, his fishing excursions in West Yellowstone as a kid, to his times as being shot down as a fighter pilot over Vietnam. He was shot down twice, to stories of his time as a leading and preeminent art dealer of art and antiquities in the Southwest. And so all these things kind of went together in that memoir. And then in the end of the memoir is this poem that leads you to his treasure, if you can follow it and understand it closely enough. So anyway, this guy was an integral part of his hunt, and you can't really do the one without the other. So when I finally was able to kind of start to reach out to him, I was like, okay, hit send on that email and cross your fingers and really, really hope from that point. And not that long after, I was thrilled to get an email back from him that said something that I still don't know if I believe to this day, but he certainly said, which was, something along the lines of, yeah, Danny, I know your work from the Wall Street Journal. I'm very familiar with you, would be happy to talk to you. Let's set up a time you can come to my house. And I was like, oh, great. So that was pretty awesome. Once I had that, I figured, okay, I've got a book, even though I do not really think that Forrest Fenn knew my work from the Wall Street Journal. I was a sports and sports business reporter, and unless he really cared about the Yankees from down in Santa Fe, I don't have a lot of reason to think he was reading my stuff. But reality is, Fenn was very good at making people feel special. He was very good at making them feel wanted and understood, and make them make. He was a salesman in every sense of the word, a consummate one. He was a very good showman. He was a real character, and he understood. There's I think a thing I relate in the book where he's at this event and he's talking to these people and he'll ask where they're from, and they'll say Memphis or whatever it is, and he'll say, oh well, I went to this restaurant, and oh, my friend Bob is from Memphis and he said this, and we went to this thing. The stories are 40 years out of date, but it doesn't matter. He's connecting to people on that level, and he was very, very good at that. So in any case, I got my Forrest Fenn interview lined up. I was ready to go. And so then, Beep and I headed off to New Mexico, both to do some treasure hunting and to meet Forrest Fenn, and to go to what's called Fennbaree, which is these events that they had every year, which are exactly what they sound like. It's a Forrest Fenn jamboree. And, as kind of crazy as that is, Fenn hunters come from all over the country to get together and celebrate the chase, and to get to talk to people who really understand what they're doing and respect it and appreciate it and don't look askance at it at all, and understand why they're doing it. And you can kind of relate to other people and talk about solves, which solve is kind of the terminology for your solution to the poem. And then if you're really lucky, as people were in the 2016 and 17 Fennbarees, you get a chance to meet Forrest Fenn. So that was a real draw for everyone involved. It was a draw for me to also get to see Fenn interacting. So basically, in the early part of June, Beep and I made our way out to New Mexico and spent some time with Fenn, and then we were able to go to Fennbaree, and also went out, on our first treasure hunts. And the first, really, pardon me for language, but incredibly half-assed hunt that we went on was in the Rio Grande Gorge area. And, it's the prologue of the book. And it, kind of relates our early adventures out there. There's a bit of a, fish out of water kind of thing to it, but it really was true. You kind of bumble out into the wilderness and just have no concept of what you're getting yourself into. It's like, I'm outside Boston, and when you're looking at a Google Maps thing from out there, and you say, okay, here's the starting point. We're going to go from here. This thing leads us to here, and then this leads us to there. All right, and then we go pick up the treasure in theory, right? It's a little bit interesting because you get out there and you think, okay, I've got my plan, I'm ready to go, I'm good. And then as soon as you do that, you realize, oh, here to there, there's a mountain in between those two things. It didn't look kind of like a mountain on maps. You see the little circles, but you think, okay, I'll walk over that hill. And no, there is no chance you are getting over that quote unquote hill. Or, the path that you thought was going to be there doesn't really exist. It's off some USGS map from 30 years ago, and it's not really there anymore. It's overgrown or just not viable or whatever. And so, we very, very quickly found that we were incredibly terrible treasure hunters and had effectively no idea what we were doing. But that's okay. That, for the purposes of this book, other than the fact that we got hailed on, which really stunk, that's okay because, it's part of the process of trying to learn this thing and understand it and understand how to get better at it. And, I think over time we did do that, but, it was an interesting thing because essentially as soon as we got all those experiences under our belt and, I got to spend time with Fenn at his house and talk to him about, why he did this and the varied reasons why he started this hunt and get out on his first hunts and get to really meet the first hunters and all that. Right away, the treasure hunt got turned on top of its head, got turned upside down. Absolutely. Because kind of in an incredible coincidence, in the same week that we were out, or it was maybe 6 days after, whatever it was, a few days after, we were out in the Rio Grande Gorge. The second hunter to die in Forrest Fenn's hunt was reported missing in that same area. So, right, he parked his car right where we parked our car, and he went into the Rio Grande River, and unfortunately, Paris Wallace, was believed to have drowned in the river. His body was found not long after, and that really changed everything, in the hunt for quite some time, and made me have to really shift the focus, from, oh, look at this fascinating, community that has developed around this thing, and this guy with, uncertain and unclear motives, and why is he doing this, and what can we understand about that, and all that, to suddenly, is this hunt going to survive? What's happening here? Is this going to continue? Should it continue? What's good, what's bad? The New Mexico State Police stepped in. It became a very, very big and contentious thing all of a sudden. So, in a book like this, you're trying to kind of monitor the twists and turns and go where they're going to take you. But I didn't expect it to go in that direction. And, it turned out that he wasn't the only person to die in that June on Forrest Fenn's hunts. So, all of a sudden there was, a dramatic shift in kind of how you have to take the narrative. And so, I was talking earlier about how when you're kind of throwing yourself into the story in this way and you're making yourself a part of the story, there are good things about that and there are bad things. And in this, you're just kind of caught up in the current, and, no ill pun intended there, but, you really are you're along for the ride in so many ways, and you have to go where that story takes you. And you have to kind of live that to that extent, to the extent it's possible, as you're going through that. So, it was almost from the, first months that I was in this thing, it was just a crazy time, trying to monitor it and understand it. But, in that, you're still kind of obligated to do the things that you need to do, which is to try to interview people and talk to them and understand them and say, okay, what's going on here? And, fortunately in all that, I was able to, do something that some were, but not a lot of other writers were able to do, which is, go back to Fenn every so often and get his thoughts on, well, what about this? And what about that? And, what happened in this thing and what changed there? And so, I was able to kind of document in semi-real time, his reactions to these things, as these events that dramatically changed his treasure hunt, and able to see the difficult forces weighing on him as somebody who, I think thought his treasure hunt was a force for good, and obviously didn't want to see people die in it, but also understood that the people dying was a threat to his treasure hunt. I think he cared deeply about the loss of life that was happening as a result of this thing, but he also believed in his hunt, and he, believed in the concept that things like this should exist in the world, even if there is some level of danger to them. One of his lines that he liked to say was, look, the 9 or so people die in the Grand Canyon every year. We don't close the Grand Canyon. And, there's another one that was, about swimming pool. If somebody drowns in a swimming pool, we don't drain all the swimming pools. We teach people to swim. And, so he had a very much, Yvette had that kind of sensibility and believed in a certain way of doing things and didn't want to see his hunt, lost from the world, because he believed it was a good thing. But he certainly understood that, there were problems that were developing as a result of it, and that things were moving, I think, past his control in some ways, that when this treasure hunt started out, it was, very much just a couple thousand hunters. It was a small thing, and I think there was a real kind of familial community sense to it. And then it changed as it grew. I think there were a few major inflection points. 2012, there's a big story in Newsweek. 2013, especially, it gets on the Today Show, and the thing just takes off in crazy fashion. And I think Fenn enjoyed that. I think he liked the notoriety he got out of it, and he enjoyed all the media that came his way, and he enjoyed getting to talk and host reporters like me at his house. And there was almost kind of a routine to it in some ways, where he'd take you into his magnificent study, and he'd show you some of these incredible things he'd found over his time as an art dealer, and in his time in the Air Force as well. And he had a very very good stump speech almost that he would kind of run through on a lot of these things. But at a certain point, it just got big. It got so big, and I think it became unwieldy and really, again, beyond his control. And Fenn was also fond of saying that 7% of the people in the world are crazy, and he certainly assigned that to his treasure hunt. That 7% at least, I think he would say, of the people in his hunt, were not doing the right things. And a lot of problems developed as a result of this. People did things they shouldn't have. People went places they shouldn't have. People took risks they shouldn't have. People put themselves and others in danger in ways they shouldn't have, and did damage to the natural environment in ways that they shouldn't have. And I think he had a tough time reconciling the fact that he did believe this was a good thing, because in his mind, he created this treasure hunt, and we talked about, why did you do this, and he had a lot of different reasons. And he would say things like he wanted to give people hope. This was coming out of the 2008-9 financial crisis. And when he hid his treasure, he wanted to give people hope and something to believe in. He said he wanted to get kids off their phones and get them out, off the couch and into the environment, and seeing the world. And I think all those things are absolutely true. I think he also liked the idea of kind of playing with the world, that he could do something like this, that he could go hide a chest out in the middle of nowhere and just do it, and maybe people will go search for it. I certainly don't think he minded the idea that people were picking up his memoir and reading the stories of his life and kind of becoming obsessively familiar with the details of his life, as a result of being involved in this treasure hunt. Because if you're going to be a Fenn hunter, you effectively have to become completely obsessed with the life of Forrest Fenn, or you could be missing a very key detail. And so many people did. And he was very much the center of kind of the I would say cult of personality that developed around this thing. That doesn't make it bad, but it does make it a thing, that's for sure. So he went and really, I think he leaned into these things for a long time, and then sometimes some bad things started to happen, and I think he started to feel a little bit like he was out of control of the hunt to some extent. And again, that's around the time when I got into it. So those were very interesting kind of paths to plumb for this, and to try to assess, where this hunt fit in the history of this larger enterprise of treasure hunting. One of the things I thought was very important to do from the start in this book was to, see, just because this thing is man-made, does that make it real? Does that make it not a treasure hunt? And does that make it any less of one? And those were questions I didn't really have the answers to as I started this. And to understand the larger history of, have there been hunts like this before? Have there been things that were very similar? Does this exist on the same continuum that people with ships sunk searching for treasure out sunken Spanish galleons? Are this all the same thing to that? And so, I really tried to kind of investigate and interrogate those questions as part of this, and did a lot of history chapters in the book to look at the history of treasure hunting and try to see where this falls into that. And I think I probably let those run a little too long, to be perfectly honest. That's, probably the thing I regret most in the book, is that I think I could have made those chapters a little shorter, but hopefully you'll all forgive me for that. And, just tried to kind of see where this fits. And I think it actually, ultimately, I believe it very much does fit. I think it very much, is part and parcel of this larger world of treasure hunting as the treasure hunt community and world kind of evolves. It's not like they're not making more treasure, so they're not sinking more Spanish galleons. And so, as treasure becomes more finite, I think the desire to find it doesn't really go away, but you have to find different ways of doing that. And a lot of that comes in tapping into these things that I think Fenn did in this hunt, almost these concepts of treasure hunting, things that harken back to, Treasure Island and Robert Louis Stevenson, and to, movies and things like, Indiana Jones and the Goonies, and things like Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and, King Solomon's Mines before that, all these kind of things. There's very much an archetype to treasure hunting, and um, kind of a pattern that is followed in a lot of stories. And I think people really liked the idea of being able to almost live one of those stories, and be a part of those things. And so, I very much tried to kind of place those in larger context. And one of the things that I also then found in doing those histories was that a lot of these treasure hunts ended in scandal. Actually, a lot of them ended in failure of some sort, and a lot of them ended in some sort of conspiracy theory, and in some sort of very ugly circumstances. It happened, I wouldn't say more often than not, but it happened enough that you can't help but notice it. And so one of the things I didn't really expect to find when I went into this was the level of conspiracy theorism that pervaded this hunt, and very much did from the start, and I think has only grown as time has gone on. I don't know if that's a symptom of a larger turn in that direction in society, or if that's something that was simply happening this, regardless. But there are a lot of conspiracy theories in this hunt, and there have been for a very long time. From the very most basic of, was this thing a hoax all along? Did Forrest Fenn really hide this treasure, which has since been essentially resolved? But to other ones that are just more esoteric about motivations and certain, directing it to certain people. And so I found, as being a part of this, that a lot of things went in that direction, that there were a lot of treasure hunting conspiracies that, unfortunately, at various points I got kind of caught up in. And did people getting me involved in them, and I was like, whoa, where is this stuff going? So that was kind of crazy to see people thinking that kind of stuff, and to find yourself perceived as a player in these things, which is certainly not what I expected when going into this, or had anything to do with, obviously. But people think a lot of different things, and so at various points I was believed to be essentially almost a part of a scheme where I was going to end up being an outsider, someone who could validate a treasure hunting find, which is not something I expected anyone to think of me as. But to use my kind of journalist outsider status to validate something for people who were involved in some crazy conspiracy. And look, they were not involved in some crazy conspiracy, but it's kind of nutty, the things that you can get dragged into, and a lot of those persist to this day. And that stuff hasn't gone away, and in some ways, for the people who remain in the fen hunting community, some of it has gotten worse, honestly. And again, I'm not sure whether that's tied to trends outside in the world, or what, but you certainly can't avoid all that kind of stuff. And that's tough, because, and so I'm gonna give a my own spoiler here, but you'll probably know this already. But when the treasure was found, which it was in 2020, in June of 2020, that created a whole new raft of conspiracies, and raft of concepts, and people doubting this and that, and took the hunt in many different directions. And I tried to follow those as everything unfolded. It was a very strange time for me, because when I sold this book, when I got the book deal for it, which I believe was in the early to mid part of 2018, so about a year after I had actually already been involved in this, I went and I had, my publisher fully understood that there was almost definitely not going to be a neat and tidy ending to this thing. That the chances of somebody finding the treasure in the lifetime of this book were very, very small. And they understood that. And so I wrote a kind of nebulous, a little bit navel gazy ending that accounted for all this kind of stuff. And quite honestly, it wasn't very good, but I had done a version of that. And I think I delivered it right around, it was either May 31st or June 1st of 2020, and had delivered a version of this manuscript to my editor, and said, like, okay, here we go. This is hopefully some version of this. Obviously, we're gonna make some changes. I'm gonna go do some follow-up interviews with people. We can double back on a lot of stuff, but here's at least a framework for a completed book. And then, like, 6 days later, I get word that the treasure has been found, and it's like, what are we gonna do? And so at the time, it was like the absolute biggest disaster that could have befallen me, but it ended up being a very, very, very significant positive in the end, because I was able to really, get close to the guy who found the treasure, and incorporate him and everything into the story. And I don't want to give too much away about that, but I was able to turn what seemed like the absolute doom of the book. And, I just got very lucky. I'm not saying I did anything beyond the ordinary, but I got very lucky in a lot of levels. And, with the timing and then my ability to kind of just reach out and get people who were important to this, and was able to kind of turn that into a real positive, and, give the book the kind of neat and tidy ending that I never expected it to have, to be honest.